Hello and welcome to Module 6 of Geopolitics. Our focus today is going to be invisible boundaries. We'll find out exactly kind of what a boundary is, also kind of different types of boundaries and how they're going to influence the development of different states. Now, when we talk about geopolitics, when we talk about boundaries, it's a very relevant topic to consider. Space ownership is probably the most volatile issue throughout human history. I mean, think back when you were a kid and you and your sibling would ride in the car and they would get too close to you. That kind of annoys you. Also, think about people that kind of talk to you and they kind of inch a little bit closer each and every time, and they start to kind of violate your space, your personal space. That doesn't sit easy with us as a species. So as a country, we kind of uphold the same things as well. And conflict is really going to arise when countries start to impose across these shared boundaries. Now, we know from previous examinations that boundaries are a very superficial thing. Boundaries change throughout time and space and all kinds of stuff. And so the main task of a political geographer or a geopolitician, if you will, is to look at the evolution of boundaries and come to an understanding of why boundaries really change. That's kind of what we're going to do today. Now, there's different types of boundaries. The first one we'll mention really quick is the physical boundary, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It's land. There's a geometric boundary, which should remind you of geometry, the study of kind of straight lines and stuff like that. And so these are countries that have straight lines. There's antecedent boundaries. These are lines that are drawn before there's even a population there. And then there's also lines that are drawn after a population arrives to a given area. And those boundaries are going to be referred to as subsequent boundaries that respects the differences of other people. And there are superimposed boundaries that are just drawn to be drawn. There's really no regard to the people or the differences, the cultural differences that exist there. And then finally there's a relic boundary, and this is a historic border. It really doesn't exist anymore, but it's left some kind of imprint. A quick example would kind of be like the Great Wall of China. I mean, that's not the edge of China anymore, but it's still kind of there. Now, a boundary, in its simplest explanation, is just an invisible line marking the extent of a state's territory. You guys have crossed all sorts of boundaries in your time and travels. Some are pretty defined, many are not. Crossing into this classroom would have been crossing into my room, in my jurisdiction, if you will. So you're crossing that boundary. Now, it could be pretty evident or pretty well known that it could be the door that is the boundary, or something else. Either way, no matter how you look at it, boundaries are superficial. Now, one thing to note within geopolitics, boundaries can often generate a lot of conflict because you have two entities that have to share a space. And anytime you have this happen, when these two entities don't see eye to eye over a certain thing, you're going to have conflict that emerges. I want to draw your attention to this link here, and feel free to click on this as you follow along on the notes. And this is going to be a list of territorial disputes that have kind of transpired throughout history. Also, it's going to bring into the discussion a lot of contemporary territorial disputes as well. So this is just a Wikipedia entry. Feel free to kind of go there, check it out, or use the link in the notes. But again, you can see, I mean, there's a lot more than what people think, a lot more than what you hear on the news. So here's Africa. And again, stop, pause, rewind if you want to kind of check some of these out, or go there yourself and look at them. So yeah, I mean, there's a ton. Then we move into Europe, and you can see some territorial disputes that are happening there. North America, there's a few. Canada and Denmark, Cuba, Mexico, and the United States have one. Central America and the Caribbean also there. So you can see there's a lot of claims by different states over different regions or territories for whatever reason. And some of these make the news and eventually lead to a full-scale invasion, occupation, or attack of some sort. Yep. So yeah, feel free to check that out. But note that there is a lot of territorial disputes in the world. Okay. Now I want to show you some of the boundaries that have been drawn throughout American history to give you kind of a quick overview. 1803 we have the Louisiana Purchase, and you can see this large chunk of land, and it's superimposed on a modern map of the United States, and so you can kind of see what the United States has done with this land, how we've kind of divided up into different boundaries. Now Iowa would be right here, and we know that there's a physical boundary on the east and the west. But really, as for the southern and northern border, they're almost superficial, just drawn to be drawn. And we'll go into kind of why Iowa defined those borders here in just a heartbeat. So a little time went on. You can see that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 took this unorganized territory from Louisiana Purchase, and it's starting to kind of make sense of it. So these boundaries are starting to be drawn, and we can see that it's going to impact the development of certain states. In this one, you can kind of see that slavery was an issue in the early 1800s, so that's going to influence kind of the states to the north and south of this Missouri Compromise line that had been established. Time goes on, and 1836, let's take a look up here. Let's look at the Wisconsin Territory. So this would have been a huge chunk of land that would have been somewhat unorganized and unpopulated for the most part. And again, you can kind of see that this green section is superimposed onto a modern U.S. map. Now, a little time goes on, and Wisconsin eventually is going to become a state or get statehood. So we see that a chunk of this land that's left over is going to be the Iowa Territory. Now here's a little fun fact. Burlington, Iowa was, at one point, the second capital of the Wisconsin Territory. So again, you can kind of see we're starting to kind of create some of these boundaries. That's 1838. 1845, here is one of the proposed borders for, northern border for the state of Iowa. So we can see here that Iowa originally was going to kind of leave its northwest corner off of this discussion, and it was going to take over a big chunk of southeast Minnesota. Another option that was on the table a year later would have been the proposed borders for the state of Iowa would have looked like this. I think you're looking at about maybe 30 miles west of Des Moines, and that would have been your state. Another discussion, another model here, which was adopted eventually as the current model, which would be like this, where you'd have the physical boundaries of the rivers of the Mississippi and Missouri on the east and west, and then the north and south borders had been determined. Now, as we take a look here, the Civil War following this in 1861 to 1865 would have also influenced the development of states. So what we see is we see a rush between free states and slave states, and so their position also would have kind of divided up the United States. So again, boundaries are kind of influencing the development, the political development of the United States in its early history. All right, let's transition just for a moment. We're going to talk about some different types of states and some different types of boundaries that influence a lot of states and countries today. So the first one is a landlocked state, and essentially it's just like as it sounds. A landlocked state has land that surrounds all of it. So it has no access to any kind of sea outlet or waterway or anything like that. And so the example that I have here is going to be Paraguay. And Bolivia is another example as well. And so this is going to kind of isolate these countries, and they're kind of under the control of the countries that surround them as well. So it's not ideal to be a landlocked state. Africa also has quite a few landlocked states. This isn't the best map in the world, but you can kind of see here of all the countries around the globe that are landlocked states. So quite a few in Central Africa, Southern Africa. We talked about these two states as well. Central Asia is also going to have a handful. Mountain borders, or excuse me, mountain boundaries. These are also going to be things that are a little more permanent. It's hard to move mountains. So Argentina and Chile are separated by the Andes Mountains. Um, Now, what's interesting about this is not a lot of boundaries are permanently established by countries within these things because mountains are hard to traverse. And so there have been disagreements where countries kind of figure out where exactly does the crest or peak of the mountain reside. And so that becomes an issue, especially as you get into mining events and issues and stuff like that within those mountains. Our next one are going to be desert boundaries. Deserts are very hard to cross and they're sparsely inhabited. These boundaries are typically very common in Africa, Asia, and so on and so forth. And a lot of the countries that have these geographies are going to be really huge because nobody wants it. So they're going to open it up. Now, one thing that might change in the future, specifically in Africa, is that underneath a lot of this sand and desert is a ton of underground water. So as our fresh water supply becomes a lot more tight and finite, there we go. What we're going to see is that these boundaries are going to be upheld a lot closer, so people can kind of mine that resource and make money and profit off of it. Water boundaries are also going to be very vital in kind of determining the location or the extent of countries as well. Rivers, we know that with the Mississippi River close to us. Lakes, oceans, those kind of mark boundaries as well. Now, when you make a boundary within a body of water, what we typically see is that the boundary is really in the middle of the waterway. So if you take a look at the boundary between Iowa and Illinois, that boundary is going to be right in the middle of the Mississippi River. Now, one thing that can be kind of tricky is water boundaries can cause difficulties because sometimes the position of the water changes over time. Rivers over the course of time are going to change in their flow and stuff like that. Ocean boundaries can also be problematic because most states claim the boundary is not at the coastline, but it's actually out at sea. And a lot of this is done for not only defense purposes, but also for resources, economic resources with fishing and such. And so this became an issue over time, and I believe in like the 1980s or somewhere in that neighborhood that the law of the sea was agreed upon. And what we see with the law of the sea is that states' rights and responsibilities concerning the ownership and use of the earth's seas and oceans was clearly defined. And so what we see as this boundary is this, that 1983, that 117 countries recognize that a country's borders lie at 12 nautical miles, and you can see that there's that 12 nautical miles right there. And so in addition to that, we have a country would have 200 nautical miles that they would kind of include into their economic zone that they'd use for fishing purposes or stuff like that. So the world, as we look at this, actually looks a little more like this, where those countries then would have claim to the waters that surround them. Now the question becomes of, well, what happens on the high seas? And that's where an individual or entity is subject to international law, which is sometimes debated and contested. Cultural boundaries as well. We see that sometimes it can be as open as that. Language is going to be something. I want to kind of get this presentation here, so let me show you the Hispanic influence. So this would be Mexico, and they share a border with the United States that we are very familiar with. And so what we see is that here's the density of the Hispanic population within the United States. The red is going to be more, so we can see that there's going to be a high density there. So the cultural border is actually here, where the political border is there, which sometimes can cause some conflict. Geometric borders, an example would be the 49th parallel between Minnesota or the United States and Canada. And sometimes we have religious boundaries as well. Let's talk about this more tomorrow.